Hello and welcome to the Eastern Front. My name is Delbo Rohach and I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm joined by my friends
Giselle Donnelly. I'm also at AEI and
Julia Joja with the Middle East Institute, Georgetown, and George Washington Universities.
On our podcast, we talk about the many challenges to European peace and security that have erupted along a line running from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, the Eastern Front, and about why those matter to the United States. Our special guest today is Katerina Stepanenko, a Russia analyst at the Institute for the Study of War. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. Katja, it's great to have you on the show. We've had your colleagues from the Institute here before, not least Fred Kagan, who's become a regular, and it feels appropriate to start a conversation roughly where we left our most recent conversation with Fred, namely on the subject of Bakhmut, that you've done a lot of work on, research on. You published recently an extended report on it, which we'll link to in the show notes. So it's a story that has been sort of ubiquitous in the media, yet many people find it somewhat impenetrable. So there was this battle going on for 10 months over a city that's basically sort of leveled by now. Russians took it. Since our conversation with Fred, Yevgeny Prigozhin of the Wagner Group then declared that the Wagner Group was leaving Bakhmut and handing it over, presumably, to the regular Russian troops. So could you just enlighten us briefly on what the meaning of the Russian taking over Bakhmut is, what they think they are getting by taking it over, what in fact they have really gained by doing it, and at what price?
Yes, thank you so much for this wonderful introduction. We just published a piece a few days ago on the Bakhmut retrospective. I highly recommend reading it, as it provides very valuable maps that explore the military side of things, of what the strategy was. So I guess to begin with, the idea for Bakhmut was that it needed to be a part of a longer offensive campaign, a longer drive onto Slavyansk. Russians never intended to just capture Bakhmut when they originally planned this drive. It was one of the stops on their way to get to Slavyansk, which was the ultimate goal. When Russians withdrew from Kiev in spring of 2022, they moved all of their efforts onto Donbass, and the idea was to drive from southeastern part of Kharkiv Oblast down the E40 highway to Slavyansk from one direction, and then from another direction, driving through Bakhmut up to Slavyansk, also on the same E40 highway. And then another grouping would have pushed from Severodonetsk, Lysychansk area in the western direction, also to reach Slavyansk. That way, Russian forces would suppress major Ukrainian strongholds on their way and also push Ukrainians into an encirclement, a wide encirclement. As the battlefield reality progressed, Russians were not able to push one of their groupings from the southeastern part of Kharkiv Oblast in the Izium area. They were unable to push it down south and had to focus on a shallower encirclement of Ukrainian forces in Severodonetsk, Lysychansk area, and they were ultimately not successful in that endeavor as well. So what happened after that was, when Russians were able to successfully capture Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, they culminated and shifted their focus on the smaller push for Bakhmut through the means of Wagner forces. Bakhmut lost its strategic significance, its limited strategic significance, around September, which is when Ukrainians were able to liberate Kharkiv Oblast. And that eliminated the northern part of the drive. And essentially, it doesn't make any more sense for Russians to push from Bakhmut to Slavyansk, because there is no more wide encirclement at this point. It's just something that is not going to happen. And the story with Bakhmut really shows us one key lesson, is that Russians are unable to quickly adapt to the realities of the battlefield. They continue to pursue goals that are not strategically important, and are failing to realize that what they're pushing for is not necessarily what is going to play a long game essentially for them. And then the second aspect of this is that really shows us that they value an informational victory over an actual military, strategically important military victory, which has been baffling to witness because right after they lost Kharkiv, they started this crazy push for Bakhmut. They started to throw, 40,000 convicts into this one small city that they knew is not going to lead them to any further offensive operations afterwards. So in that sense, I hope I answered some of your questions with what the mindset was. And now, I watched some Russian television a couple of days ago, and the way that they portray Bakhmut is quite literally they compare it to Berlin. Like the Soviets have reached Berlin. That's the way that they approach it, and it's quite ridiculous.
We should peel this onion back a couple of layers, but Katya, for our listeners, we should probably give a little bit of basic Eastern Ukrainian geography. I have to refer to maps myself in order to keep track of, especially when you get down to the Bakhmut level of, population centers and stuff like that. Do you think it's fair to say that, we have to Eastern Ukraine and the so-called Donbass is sort of grouped around a handful, maybe 3-4 cities that lie in the center of the region. And some of them the Russians have held and continue to hold. And as you referenced, they've failed to achieve many of their objectives for this year. So if you want to maybe talk about what we deduce the Russian original campaign design to be. There's the question of encircling Ukrainian forces, but it's always never really clear with the Russians whether they're driven by territorial and terrain objectives or, trying to decimate reduce Ukrainian military power. What would be your take on the way the Russians approached this offensive, if we can call it that, over the last 6 months or so?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. The original idea was definitely more territorial based. They really thought that they are going to be able to drive through all of the Donbass area and reach the administrative border of Donetsk Oblast by, I believe, May 9th was their original goal, May 9th of 2022. But that obviously has issues with the reality of, the time-space realities are completely messed up in Russian strategic planning, and they were unable to do that. So they needed to downscale, and the downscaling was, let's entrap Ukrainian forces. Let's encircle them and weed them out and force them to fight through. That had failed on a larger scheme, right, on the wider encirclement. So then they changed to, let's push for Bakhmut, both for territorial objectives, but also for an opportunity to weed out Ukrainian troops, to encircle them in Bakhmut and so on. However, if I was a Russian serviceman, I would, or Russian military strategist, I would see the way that Ukrainians have fought in the past, right? And see that they have a track of conducting very strategic control withdrawals from their positions. They don't stay in dangerous positions. They didn't stay in Lysychansk when they perceived that they could be encircled or there was any potential threat to Ukrainian grouping. So in that sense, it was kind of weird because for Bakhmut, they were pushing from north and south of the city with the idea of encircling Ukrainian troops, but they were also pushing west through the city at the same time. So it looked like they didn't even want to trap them in the first place. It looked like they were pursuing two objectives: to capture the city, because likely Russian President Vladimir Putin was urgently calling for it, and then on the other hand, they also were trying to push this objective of scaring Ukrainians off, encircling them, weeding them out, and so on. So it's strange. Their military thinking is very chaotic in their approach for battles like these. It's almost like they're throwing something and hoping that it will stick, from what it looks like, in the way that they've conducted this fight.
So now that it seems to me that, or for me at least, I think for many others, I was just having a conversation with a friend who works for the government, and she was asking me the same thing. Where are we actually with the Bakhmut battle? Exactly because of this discrepancy that you're describing really well between informational war and actual reality on the ground. And when I read your report earlier, you end exactly with the question of, has this battle really ended? And so leaving, and I'll ask about that in a bit later, leaving Ukrainian reports aside and trying to make sense just on the Russian side between what the Russians are declaring, who on the Wagner side have declared, semi or total victory in Bakhmut now 5 or 6 times, and where actually you can track the situation on the ground. Where are we actually? Has the battle ended? How much fighting is there anymore? The only thing we know for certain is that, or is that even certain, that Wagner is withdrawing to be replaced theoretically by conventional forces. So, can you help us kind of bridge this gap between information and informational warfare and the actual situation in Bakhmut?
Yes, of course. So Wagner announced victory on May 20th, I believe, and Russian Ministry of Defense and Putin also claimed victory over the city on the 21st. Now, this announcement really came after Ukrainians began to successfully counterattack. Ukrainians regained the initiative on Bakhmut's northern and southern flanks, while Russia continued to push for territorial gains in the city. The call for victory over Bakhmut city, I mean, Wagner could have called it a week prior to this. It was purely symbolic. They were fighting for probably like remaining couple of meters of the city for quite some time. They don't carry any strategic significance for Ukrainians. Ukrainians they appear to be holding two ground lines of communications to the city, one through Hromve and then the other one through Ivanivske. So both lead to the city. This is very necessary for Ukrainians because, Russians are very road bound. They need roads to continue any type of operations further. So it looks like Ukrainians are controlling these, and the fighting in Bakhmut itself had decreased. So Russians are not pushing forward past the city, and instead have assumed a defensive both in the city and on the flanks because of the Ukrainian counterattacks. Ukrainian officials, and also we've observed from some of Russian sources, indicate that Russians are bringing some reinforcements to Bakhmut, likely possibly from Avdiivka area. I say this because we have observed some DNR, Donetsk People's Republic, units operating in Bakhmut that were not previously there, which could indicate that they were transferred to support the flanks at the threat of Ukrainian counterattacks. Wagner does not seem to be pushing forward. It looks like they really have approached that culmination point. I want to preface that we have been observing indications that they would have likely culminated a lot earlier if they have not received some support from Russian regular forces. That is something that we've been reporting on for quite some time. We saw that they were suffering significant casualties in December, but were unable, but were stopped from essentially culminating by receiving reinforcements from regular formations that they refused to recognize were fighting with them until Prigozhin later recognized that they were supporting the flanks. So this leaves us with an ongoing fight where Ukrainians have the initiative, a potentially turbulent transition between the conventional forces and Wagner forces. We know that their connections, there's obviously conflict between the Russian Ministry of Defense and Wagner. So I'm not sure to what extent this withdrawal is going to be smooth. The relief in place, I'm not confident that Russia has the capacity to quickly reinforce those positions as Wagner is withdrawing at the threat of the Ukrainian counterattacks in the area, while the flanks are also in need of reinforcements to sustain their positions. So that's an interesting challenge for them. As of now, we have not seen any reports from Ukrainians essentially saying that Wagner withdrew from the city itself. However, there are some mill bloggers and obviously Wagner financier Yevgeny Prigozhin that are claiming that they're withdrawing. But so far on the ground, we have not seen that movement just yet, only reinforcements arriving into the area.
So just a quick follow-up. Now, compared to, say, 3 months ago, what would you say is the force rapport on the Russian side between conventional forces, Wagner forces, mercenary forces, and then DNR, which is a bit of a different category, right?
I mean, it's really complex to say. We're not there, but I can imagine if, for example, Wagner financier Yevgeny Prigozhin recently had a whole meltdown where he was blaming the 72nd Brigade for military failures around Bakhmut. I feel like that probably has some consequences on the rapport that these regular units that are reinforced by mobilized men that didn't want to be there in the first place, and financially incentivized contract servicemen, that they wouldn't like this criticism too much. Prigozhin also kind of released his report card at the end of the battle for Bakhmut in his words, of how select units have performed, and made fun of the airborne troops and claimed that they weren't even there. I don't think that really benefits, with the building relationships aspect between the Russian Ministry of Defense and Wagner.
So we've seen a lot of Yevgeny Prigozhin lately, making the news and rattling the Russian MOD and sort of like doing things that are kind of hard to understand in an autocratic system from somebody looking at it from the outside. And the question I want to ask you is, like in this most recent of his rants, he makes basically the case for Russia to start taking this situation of total war, let's say, seriously, and putting in real resources and putting Russians through sort of real hardship to sort of fight this war, mobilizing the country towards this one goal of taking over Ukraine. Obviously, that's not the step that Putin has taken yet, who's been very cautious in how he sort of sells the special military operation at home, and we've seen this mobilization not go according to plan. But what are the odds, given sort of your view of the Russian sort of public debate and state of public opinion, that something like a situation of sort of total war could be achieved, a sort of total mobilization on the sort of scale we saw in the Second World War, where like really everybody in the society would be sort of directed by this quasi-totalitarian state in Russia towards this one objective of conquering Ukraine.
Yeah, I think you're very right into pointing out that Putin has not reached that point yet, and I don't think that he wants to reach that point. The decision to mobilize any personnel relies exactly on Putin. He is very concerned about the sustainability and the health of his regime. And we know this because we have seen how he reacted to the previous partial mobilization, how he tried to scapegoat it, downplay it. But we also, we have a couple of reports analyzing Putin's decision making. And in one of my reports, we looked at the way that he was preparing for mobilization, or someone in his cabinet was preparing for mobilization in January of 2023. And there were some indications that they were planning to do so. I mean, they were trying to introduce the electronic, conscription notification system. They were proposing, they had several deputies go on live television and talk about the necessity for full-scale mobilization. But he didn't do it. And he missed out on a key time where he could have done it, which is before the spring conscription cycle. Things get made really complicated for the Russian bureaucratic system around conscription periods, which was on April 1. And ever since, we've seen Putin intensify the crypto mobilization campaign, meaning recruitment of contract servicemen, expansion of private military companies. We are seeing recruitment in DNR, LNR, and occupied Ukrainian territories. This is something that he had historically done before. The only reason why he went for partial mobilization in the first place is because he had Kharkiv Oblast collapsing in front of his eyes. And the decision for mobilization last time came, I believe, 9 or 10 days after Putin had suffered a significant military defeat in Kharkiv. So to say that he is actively, thinking about mobilizing or declaring, it's going to be a stretch, because I think he's very sensible to his regime, to the fractures within his regime, and he already saw firsthand what the previous mobilization had done, and the conflict that it had raised in several small villages across Russia, and the broken information space that he had on Russian propaganda channels, and so on. So I think for mobilization, for any further mobilizations, it is the question of, is Putin willing to take that risk again? And I think that, if he sees another military failure, he might be convinced to do another partial mobilization. But in the current state, even at the threat of the counteroffensive, he does not seem to be, considering that possibility, likely out of concern for his regime.
It's fascinating that you say that, because it looks like when you look at Russia from like the West, the only voices that you hear are really just these super aggressive nationalistic mill bloggers and or the lunatics on television, the sort of Solovyevs, etc., who are just sort of bleating about how Russia needs to get into a sort of total war and like nuke Ukraine and Warsaw and all the rest of it. So those seem to be totally sort of disconnected from where, like, I guess most ordinary Russians are.
Well, okay, it makes for good television, right? In the Russian context, but you could put that stuff on Tucker Carlson or Ben Shapiro's show almost. Look, one lesson that should have been apparent from the prior mobilization is that the Russian military can't produce militarily effective units at scale and in a timely way. They don't have the training pipeline to do it. They at this point, they don't really have much in the way of equipment. So what is the difference between a Mobik and a Wagnerite? Maybe the Mobik lives a week longer than the Wagner, convict or something like that. They don't produce stormtroopers or whatever you want to call them. Katerina, let me ask you to kind of turn the perspective around a bit and try to figure out what the Bakhmut campaign may mean for a coming Ukrainian counteroffensive. I mean, clearly the campaign has robbed Wagner of whatever military value it had. It's been a magnet for Russian conventional forces and even some of their more elite airborne units, to the degree that those units are even a shadow of what they once were. And as you rightly point out, the continuing threat that the Ukrainians can pose of either encircling or retaking Bakhmut. So it's like the more the Russians trumpet this supposed victory, the more catastrophic, that means that they have to keep paying a price to ensure that it, stays in the win column or something like that. So without, I know there's a question in there someplace. But seriously, how do you think the Bakhmut campaign will affect the fighting that's about to take place? in the in the larger Ukrainian counteroffensive context?
I want to start answering this question by prefacing that we don't report on Ukrainian counteroffensive.
Yes, yeah, Fred says that.
Yeah.
Yes, we pledge allegiance to to ISW.
Yes, it's
Yes.
something that we obviously don't want to make it too easy for Russians.
But how is it aided or constrained Russia's ability to respond elsewhere?
So we've observed an interesting dynamic at the beginning of the year, and it was that Russian Ministry of Defense was really trying to deprioritize Bakhmut direction in favor of other directions. So they started, there was the whole winter military offensive campaign that they were trying to push from Luhansk Oblast to reach Donetsk Oblast administrative borders. There was the whole mess of fighting around Vuhledar, where Russians decided to move in a column across the minefield. That didn't really go well for them. We also thought that they were trying to they tried to intensify fights for Avdiivka. And after they failed to achieve the winter offensive operation, win any significant territories whatsoever, we noticed some conservation efforts. So there was a decrease in shelling in certain areas, less combat clashes. And of course, taken from the words of Prigozhin, there was a decrease in ammunition provided to him and to Bakhmut in particular. And he was screaming about the fact that he doesn't have any reinforcements, no one's coming to save him. And we assessed that the Russian Ministry of Defense was likely trying to prepare some grounds, before the counteroffensive. They didn't want to just give everything to Wagner, to blow through the remaining mobilized personnel in Bakhmut. At which point we saw Prigozhin take it into his hands and threaten and say that I'm going to withdraw if you don't give me mobilized personnel, if you don't give me ammunition. And I think they obliged by at least certain part of this because of how informationally important that moment was, right? And how bad it looked for Russia. At this current time, it places Wagner in a position when they might skip out on the counteroffensive in general. And Wagner has been perceived to be one of the best Russian assault forces that we have seen. They fought for major urban centers, in Lysychansk, Severodonetsk. They fought for Popasna. They fought for Bakhmut. It is a force, and they are depleted, and they're signaling that they cannot fight no more, that they have to take 2 months to step down and recuperate and retrain. And that's significant because not only is this culminative force not able to sustain defenses, right, on this vulnerable area, and we see that it's vulnerable. It's not something that Russians were able to defend around Bakhmut because they were focused on driving forth and trying to advance rapidly without taking it back to defend their positions. So it exposes them to a potential area vulnerability where they lose one of their key fighters because they cannot fight anymore at the time where their lines are stretched thin and they have to defend a really long front line. It's not a small segment that they have to protect. They don't know where Ukrainian counteroffensive is going to happen. No one does at this point, I feel like, but it really puts a lot of not just mental stress on them, but also from a military perspective, they need to relocate resources to make sure that Bakhmut is also defended alongside of all of the other front lines that they have active. And that is where the withdrawal, if it happens or even it doesn't happen, it's still a significant challenge for Russian forces ahead of the counteroffensive.
Before we need to wrap up, I want to ask you focused just over the last few minutes very much on the reality on the ground. And before we wrap up, I want to ask you also about the Russian reality, right? The information space, because I know you're following this very closely. So, kind of a few elements packed into one question. You followed Kharkiv and Kherson through the eyes of the mill bloggers, also in terms of adaptation of narratives. And you've told us now how, Bakhmut was portrayed and is continuing to be portrayed in the Russian information sphere, whether that's on social media, on Telegram, or on TV, as the new Berlin. And so, with them having in one way to adapt to the losses around Kharkiv and Kherson that were bloody, and with the so-called victory around Bakhmut that we don't know whether it's a victory or not, and the counteroffensive coming, at least in the common psyche, right, of Russia that needs to adapt. What are you hearing? What are people saying? Particularly, I'm thinking about the famous mill bloggers that you guys are following so closely. What are they suggesting should come next, either in terms of defensive positions or in terms of unrealistically maybe moving towards conquering another area?
And if I can just add to that very quickly, another dimension which has to do with these recent Ukrainian incursions into Russia and mysterious explosions happening all over the place. Whether most recently it was, I think, a drone in Krasnodar. Earlier we saw drones over the Kremlin. This is stuff that has to get Russians rattled a little. And I wonder to what extent it will detract from their readiness to actually fight in Ukraine if there is suddenly this pressure to, fortify the Russian-Ukrainian border and to sort of invest into capacity, which is going to be away from the battlefield as a result of that.
Yeah, those are two wonderful questions. With the preparations for the counteroffensive, we have observed a very stark difference from the way that Russians reported on the counteroffensive before, around Kharkiv, Kherson counteroffensives, and now. Now it seems like they are setting information conditions for both scenarios. The Russian defense works out really well, and they're able to repel Ukrainian attacks. And then the other one is, Ukrainian counteroffensive was successful. Here's why. So we've noticed that there was some preparations in the info space when Putin had an interview on state television, and the journalist legitimately asked him, what about this counteroffensive? And in that interview, Putin went on and talked about deployment of tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus and so on. So that was one. They are almost embracing it a little bit more head on, whereas before they just downplayed it. The two main narrative is, the first one is, if we lose the counteroffensive, this is all because we're fighting NATO, we're not fighting Ukrainians. Of course, they're going to win, a battle because NATO has given them, the most incredible equipment on this planet. And that was a hard battle. That's okay. We are still strong. We're going to keep on fighting, so on. And then the other line was, we are setting all of the conditions to deter any potential counteroffensives in Ukraine. We're making all of these strikes every day on Kiev with no absolute reason to strike medical facilities, but so we're seeing that every time that there's a missile strike, and there has been already 13 just in Kiev Oblast this month. They claim that they deterred a Ukrainian counteroffensive by one day, and they are making it impossible for Ukrainians to achieve any successes. And so, if Ukrainian counteroffensive is unsuccessful, there's a backlog of informational conditions that they've been setting to, say that we've tried everything and look, it worked. So that's that. In terms of mill bloggers, they are at panic. Anytime that there is any type of a localized counterattack, the information space blows up. They talk about one small village that probably doesn't matter. To them, it's the end of the world. There's a lot of, people turning onto each other, claiming, that they're starting panic. Very similar to exactly how they acted last year when we first started to see some commotions around, Kherson. It exploded. We probably spent like the whole day in the office just trying to go through the panicked cries, and trying to catch as much as possible of that. And they are very prone to panic. We saw that with Belgorod. I think as of today, we're still filtering through thousands of meltdowns that are still ongoing about Belgorod, even though there's nothing going on in Belgorod right now. So they are less optimistic about Russia's ability to continue further offensive operations. The idea kind of went from, maybe we need just mobilization and, mobilize the economy, mobilize industry, and everything will be great, to now saying, yeah, maybe this is not really possible. We just have to keep on fighting, but I don't know if we will be able to achieve the maximalist goal of reaching Ukraine. They're really becoming a little bit more practical in their assessments, where they think, that the possibility of Ukrainians being successful, even on a limited scale in this counteroffensive, is more probable than Russia continuing the offensive operations at its current state. So in that sense, it's very interesting. Mill bloggers were also a lot more skeptical about Bakhmut than what Russian propagandists were. A lot of mill bloggers were saying, something along the lines that culmination is near, that Wagner is not going to push forward because they're tired. They need time to rest. They can't just go to Slavyansk now. Whereas the propagandists were saying, this is the best door that has opened in front of us. We're going to push for Slavyansk and Konstantinivka, and we're going to get to Vohledar from there. And that just, that's not going to happen anytime soon. So that's kind of the two worlds that we're seeing. One that is becoming a little bit more practical, but still clouded by the vision of, we need to win this war. And then the other one that is still kind of torn away from reality, but is aware enough to set some informational conditions to justify both scenarios.
That's super interesting and very good news.
Can I squeeze in one last question about sort of what the Russian conversation is about Crimea at this point? Are they afraid that they might lose their grip, or that the peninsula will become, cut off and isolated? Or what are they telling one another about this?
Yeah, they're very afraid of this. They are stating that, Ukraine has been signaling that they want to come to Crimea. They're going to try to interdict ground lines of communication. They're going to attack us. And we see this panic through field fortifications throughout, the south. You can see them in Zaporizhia. You can see them in Kherson Oblast. And you can see them in northern Crimea and along the beaches. They're really worried about Crimea. They're really worried about, frankly, I'm going to be honest, every day they panic about something. And it can be somewhere irrelevant, and they will call it a counteroffensive. And then one of the mill bloggers will come out and call them out and say, this is not the counteroffensive. Like, come on, stop spreading the panic. And that's how usually it goes. But they're really worried about how vulnerable their positions are. And that is really we've been seeing a lot more of that since the victory over Bakhmut that they claim, is that they're worried that after Bakhmut, they really need to prepare defensives, but that's something that they should have done before, at least in that area.
I will just say that few things warm the cockles of us here on the Eastern Front as the disappointment and panic among the Russian mill bloggers. So, and I just hope we'll have more reasons for Schadenfreude in the coming weeks and months. Katja, thank you so much for enlightening us and giving us this education on what's happening on the Eastern Front.
Thank you so much. This was great. I love this introduction to podcasting.
Yes, so we should tell our listeners that this was Katerina's first podcast appearance. We don't need to flatter her, but I thought this went rather brilliantly.
Thank you.
From me, Dalbaraj,
Julia Sosa,
and Giselle Donnelly.
Thank you for listening to The Eastern Front, a podcast dedicated to security challenges that have erupted along the line running from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. You can find more episodes and additional content on our website, ai.org, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please do get in touch with us on Twitter using the hashtag EasternFrontPod, written as one word. And don't forget to sign up for the Eastern Front's newsletter through the link included in the show notes for more content from the Eastern Front. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing us. Thank you, and goodbye.